episode 2. Here we are. I will say, after the first one, it was wild to have people comment on what I was saying. The people that I've known for years were like, I never knew this about you. Or listening to myself back, I was like, oh, self-awareness. That's great.
I thought it was fun to listen to how we sound when we have a conversation.
Yeah.
Because I guess I'm in the midst of it. And so I don't, like, from the outside looking in, I was like, oh, that's what that's like.
Yeah. This is why people are concerned sometimes.
Yeah. I had one friend say, I loved it. It was kind of like you guys were, like, on a FaceTime call. I said, that makes sense.
I love that, though.
Yeah.
That's, like, the biggest compliment, I would say, almost ever. Because I always want that, like, friend FaceTime. Or, like, mom FaceTime, if you're a little mama.
If you're a little mama.
But yes, welcome back. If you're still here with us, thank you. So today we are launching into, it's still about us, but it's definitely segueing into the life of a therapist. And it is things your therapist friend won't tell you. So basically the ins and outs of the industry and what this job is like, and sometimes how it impacts our people and the things that we don't really share.
Yeah. It's genuinely pulling back the curtain on, like, what we feel sometimes, as well as potentially, like, what other people wonder about us, question about us, and how they feel about us.
There were a few things for prepping for this episode where I was like, do I really want to say this? Like, yeah, actually, that's the whole purpose. So
we're getting real.
Here we
real
are.
And authentic.
So to get ready for this episode, we asked our social media, and we're just going to plug it. If you don't follow our social media, it is at Soul Haven Counseling on Instagram. You should. It's a pretty fun time over there. But we asked our followers, if you were to ask a therapist anything, what would you ask? And we got some great questions that we have here.
In the magic cup. Sarah, would you like to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh my gosh. Do therapists have therapists? If so, how do they pick one? I feel like it would be hard. Yes. And something that we're actually taught in graduate school is that if you don't have a therapist, you're honestly like kind of unethical, I'd say. So yes, therapists should have therapists. Do they? No, they don't. And I think that we also understand barriers to therapy sometimes. Like in my current state, I wouldn't be able to afford myself, which is kind of wild to think about. Yeah. And that also kind of answers another question that someone has later. But I will say that it's recommended that you have a therapist more often than not, with the understanding that there are barriers. And kind of adding to that, picking a therapist as a therapist is very difficult because not everyone will take therapists as clients. Like for me, like I do take therapists as clients. I love taking those kind of clients. It's really fun, but it is a challenge. So not every therapist will take fellow therapists. It's kind of like Inception, makes you really wonder like who's at the top of the food chain.
The big therapist.
Like
who's
like mommy therapist, basically. But yes, it is really hard to pick a therapist. And it is one where like when I found mine that I have now, she's amazing. I was really upfront and said, hey, like just letting you know, like I'm a clinician, but I do plan to check that at the door when I log on for myself. So yes, it's hard. It does require a little bit more planning, but it's kind of what you have to do. I'm a good therapist because I have one myself too. Gives me a different perspective too.
Yeah. Here we go. Okay. Ooh, this one's fun. Is it bad to be, quote, too aware and that you sympathize for your enemies? First of all, I love that enemies. It makes me think of like a super villain. Like, they're my enemy.
It's like the dark side versus the light side.
Yeah. Is it bad to be too aware? Okay, so that's a hard one because it's almost like a yes and a no. But I will preface with I don't believe in good versus bad. I believe in helpful versus unhelpful. And like sometimes, you know, being so self-aware or just aware in general can be unhelpful. Like especially I know when I look at myself, perfectionism. I am constantly judging myself and that causes anxiety. And because of that, I'll be like, oh, is that person like upset with me? Did I say that the right way? Can I do this better next time? And then that can make me just like tailspin into spiraling and then just quite frankly like lose it emotionally and just apologize excessively. So in those instances, like that is not helpful. But at the same point, it is very helpful to be aware of your surroundings and to be aware of like what's going on inside of you. So maybe splitting that versus like being very self-aware of how you're feeling versus being very aware of, I don't know, how everything else is going on outside of you. Sometimes we can overanalyze that and look at people and be like, oh, what is she thinking? I don't know. It's like, in reality, we can't change that.
We're not a mind reader either.
No.
People think that we can read minds. Like, I honestly don't want to. And we can't. That's just the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then sympathize with your enemies.
Say, what about the enemies? I'm really curious to see your answer.
So from a, I guess, biblical perspective, it's almost that whole, you know, like love your neighbor no matter what and having forgiveness. And so like that sympathize word kind of going along with like empathizing, I don't think that's a bad thing.
No.
I wouldn't say it's a bad
Just
thing.
different perspective.
Yeah, like some people are like, I'm never talking to them ever again. It's like, I mean, okay, that's fair.
Okay.
But then also like if you feel poorly for maybe someone that like has treated you wrong or has been mean to you in the past and you're like, you know what, I really wonder like what's going on in their life. That's kind of where I go to. It's like, hey, well, what's happening with them that they're having that reaction towards me and then potentially like feeling upset about that. I don't think that's a bad thing.
It's not petty, I wouldn't say.
No.
Just adds layers of understanding, especially if your intentions are good. Like, you're not wanting to be self-aware to be self-critical.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not wanting to be aware of somebody else to be critical of them.
Yeah.
I think it's all about your intentions, maybe.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
That was a good question.
I like that one.
And I like the enemies.
Yeah, I do like that.
Your enemies.
Are therapists paid well? No, they're not.
Easy answer. Just no.
And that's something that I'll really talk about later on in this episode, is that people really do assume that therapists are like a high prestige occupation in terms of compensation. No. There's like no better way to say it. I hate that. But I will say that like I'm very aware of like a teacher's salary because obviously we both worked in the schools. I know what I made. I know what you made. It is more than that. And I will say that like that is very a place of privilege to be in, to have a master's degree and a license to practice therapy and to be compensated a little bit more than like a basic standard of living would be set at. So it's not like we are below poverty line sort of compensation, but it's not what you would expect. If you think about a therapist in their office, you think of a lot of different like creature comforts, and that doesn't typically align with the average compensation of a therapist. And of course, it does range depending on the state you're in and what kind of licensure you have. Like I know therapists up in like New England are almost compensated double of what we are down in Georgia. And it's tough because therapists are often compensated based on sessions. So it's like you're paid per session. So you can be compensated more, but you have to see more clients. And then there's an ethical question of when is enough? And like it just becomes a little messy. So short answer being like, no, they're not paid well at all, but you do have the option to be paid well. It just requires a lot of work and a lot of accountability to make sure that you're being ethical in chasing a dollar amount, which sounds really bad. And you have to do it very humanely, I will say.
Yeah. And it varies based on if you're in private practice versus like social work versus community based. I mean, there's so many other environments that it changes. Like I know in Roswell, like you can charge a little more than you can in Rome. And so that, you know, makes a difference of how much you're getting paid. But there's also, you know, cost of living, all the things. But yeah, short answer, no. Just like all the other helping professions, you know, teaching, school counselor, nurses, nurse practitioner. I mean,
the helping professions just like as a whole aren't compensated fairly, I will say. And even then, I think for counseling specifically, whoever determined, whatever big entity determined the compensation rates for therapists didn't consider independent living therapists. Like I remember when I talked to like supervisors when I first started going into therapy, and they would say like, oh, are you relying only on your income to live? And I would say, yeah, I am. And I realized that most therapists don't. And I am in another position of privilege now where like I am in a dual income household, but I didn't start my career there. But even then, my first job, I did Uber Eats afterwards until my car became okay, if your car is more than 10 years old, you can't do things like Uber Eats and DoorDash. So I did that until my car went out of date, and then I babysat. And so I think it's this idea of like, these systems aren't very kind to helping professionals. And so I think that question definitely opens a bigger door.
Yeah. Okie dokie. Ooh. Should have got a bowl for this. It would make it easier.
It makes a fun sound though.
Yeah. Let's see. How are you so awesome?
Oh. That was Nikki.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
That's so sweet.
I'm going to break anonymity for this one because this is a fellow therapist.
Nikki. Well, this definitely goes to both of us. How are you so awesome?
I just love Nikki. If you're listening to this, Nikki, we love you. You know, we're going to go into a lot of things in this episode that make it sound like therapy is really dark and like a really tough profession to be in. And in some ways it is. But I think that a big strength of it is like a question like this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are the people that we can connect with, including Nikki.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I wouldn't consider myself awesome. I consider myself to be very average, but I consider Nikki to be awesome.
True that. Every conversation that I've had with her so far, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm learning just from having a conversation. This could be CE credits. Yeah, no, I agree. I don't feel like I am awesome, which is wild that we don't, because we have done so much in the past couple months. I mean, just looking back on my life like a year ago, I would have never thought that we'd be doing this.
No.
Which is wild.
I would have wanted to.
Definitely. Would have been like a, what is it?
Like a pipe dream. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say pipeline. That too. Pipeline to my soul. But yeah, like a pipe dream for sure. But yeah, no, I feel like just a human. But the people around me, we have so many great supportive people, and I'm sure all of them are listening right now, and we love you for that. And that's honestly what keeps us doing what we're doing. I know, especially for me, like being able to go home and say, okay, let's just like chill and not talk about feelings for just like a hot minute. And maybe like my roommate, Monica, I'll ask before we potentially edit this out. I'm sure she'll be fine with it. But my roommate, Monica, should be like, okay, what movie are we watching? The other night she said, can you make me a margarita? And I was like, yes.
I love that.
So just having like people to surround you.
Yeah.
That helps so much.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree. Same. This last one. Yeah. No? Yes?
I think we each got 2.
Oh, wait.
So you'll get one and then I'll get one.
Oh, I'll take this one. Is the work satisfying? That's a really great question. Yeah, I will say. I have to be honest. The work became more satisfying when I decided that it didn't define me. And I think that could be like something sewn onto a pillow or something like that. That's a very profound.
This work does not define me.
Exactly. Because I feel like the qualities that make people a therapist and make someone a decent therapist are overall like very positive qualities in a person that often like define you, whether it's something that's like an empathetic listener, just kind of morally not awful, and just works hard, things like that. But I do think that there's almost this pressure, I think as a whole, not just for therapists, that your work is who you are. Like your job is you, and that's your whole identity. And I do remember that because our work is in like feelings and the human experience, for a long time I almost felt like that had to define me. Like I even remember like, sorry Ryan, being on dating apps and people would be like, what do you do? I'm like, I'm a therapist. Or like, tell me about yourself. And the first thing I would always say is, I'm a therapist. I'm sorry, but that is not the only thing about me. It's just part of it. So I do think that when I decided that being a therapist in this job wasn't who I was, that is when the work became so much more satisfying. And I got to have more fun with it too. And it's just like a fun like accessory to who I am.
It's a bonus.
It is.
It's a bonus to Sarah.
Oh, thank you.
Not just makes Sarah.
The work is great though. I am very lucky that like this is my dream job. Didn't really know what my dream job was, but I'm in it.
Snaps for that. Okay, last one. Do you have favorite clients?
Oh.
It's the same thing as a yes and a no. So all clients are different. I look at our relationship differently sometimes. Like there's some clients that I feel like we just kind of like vibe. And so I don't have to kind of get out of this brain space of like, okay, make sure that you have your face right. Make sure that you have your body right. Because sometimes I'll get stuck into that because I have some clients that'll look at me and every little thing that I'm doing. And so I know that in those ways I become a better clinician because I am having to be very aware of how I'm like presenting in front. But there are some clients that we just came in and it was just like, they got it. Like sometimes my face will be like, oh no, you're right. You're like, I know what you're going to say. And usually, and if this client's listening, she'll know what it is. But I'll say, she's like, no, I did not self-care. And I'm like, okay, well, and sometimes that's as easy as like showering or walking. But yeah, so yes and no. Like there's some clients that I feel more comfortable to just kind of present with, but there's other clients that I feel like I'm becoming a better clinician just by sitting in the room with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like that's so important to be able to have both. There's never been a client that I've been like, like groaning about. I feel like sometimes counselors are like, oh, I have that client. I don't think I've ever felt that. Like every single person that shows up, like you show up differently, of course, but I've never just been like dreading to see them. And I think that's just because we all have innate things that make us awesome.
I think it also shows that like you're ethical.
Well, yeah.
And you only take like the right fit of client too.
That too. Could be that. Like I will never accept a client where I feel like I would not be able to help them. So like if they come in with a presenting concern and I'm like, that seems like it's out of my circumference of what I know, then I'm just going to be like, okay, let's refer out. And I think because of that, you're probably right. Of like, there's never a client that I come in dreading. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah.
That's a really good question. I feel like that's always what my clients are asking of like, am I your favorite? And sometimes it's like, you're one of them. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But like, I genuinely love things about every single client.
Yeah.
You're right. Like they make us better. Yeah. It's a gift. So things that our therapist friends won't tell you.
So essentially things that we don't tell you.
Yeah.
Sometimes until now.
That's true. So just like the things that just go unsaid.
Yeah.
And I do think that it's important to distinguish a friend who like their profession as a therapist versus the quote unquote therapist friend. Because I don't know about how you feel, but when I have a client who comes in and says like, I'm the therapist friend of the group, it honestly breaks my heart. And it drives me up a wall because it's just, I understand the intentions are really good. And when you refer to a friend as a therapist friend, you are talking about those positive qualities that I mentioned of like being a great listener, being just like a kind friend, being understanding, seeing multiple viewpoints. Those are all wonderful qualities to have in a person and to have in a friend. Absolutely. But then when you add on the label of a therapist friend, that's when it's like, okay, are your relationships balanced? Like, do you feel like you are listening more than you're talking? And I think that it's important. So if you're listening to this and you feel like you are a therapist friend, celebrate those qualities in yourself, but also don't be afraid to say like, hey, I have a life too. If you're talking to a friend, say like, no, these are things about me. And I think that something I struggle with is acknowledging that I am a person. I'm not just a listener. But I think that there's this dynamic of like, you can only listen sometimes. So
yeah,
therapist friend, quote unquote, let's learn our boundaries. They're really hard, but like you can be a good listener and still have boundaries, and you can be a good friend and still have boundaries. But then friend who's actually a licensed therapist, I feel like they're usually just off duty with friends. At least I am. I'm like, I'm not. What is it? The phrase is like, are you psychoanalyzing me? No. I'm really not.
Yeah, no. And I will say that I know, especially for me, and I would assume that it's kind of the same. All of us as therapists at some point hit a moment in our social interactions where we're like, oh, I'm doing a lot of listening and I'm doing a lot of like trying to understand, which for me got me to be like, oh, I'm actually good at this. Like maybe I should take this as a career. But at the same point, you're exactly right. Like boundaries are important because I'm not on the job. And sometimes, I mean, it's emotionally draining to listen all day long and then to leave and then to feel like you're doing the same thing in interactions that are just supposed to be like fun. And not saying that they're not fun, but sometimes it is just you leave that conversation. You're like, oh, I feel like I just had like another work day and now I need to like decompress. Whereas I kind of just wish we talked about like, I don't know, like Cheetos.
The fluffy stuff. You're right.
Yeah.
And so I think that, so this episode is really catered towards the friend that is a licensed therapist. So it's not the things your good listener friend won't tell you. It's things that like your friend who's a licensed therapist and working in the field won't mention. But we did just want to kind of shout out the quote unquote therapist friend and really kind of affirm that like your experiences are, I can't imagine, because obviously we're therapists now, but we probably were the therapist friends before we got all the letters after our names.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard and it's very lonely. So just know that if you're listening and you feel like you fall into that category, we see you. You deserve to speak up. And whatever it is you're probably not telling your loved ones because you're afraid of taking up space, please do.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go into the next one, the next bullet point that we discussed, that we suffer in silence.
It's really true.
Like,
I hate that it's true. It's very true.
It's so true. I think last podcast I said, I feel like I don't process, and sometimes I feel like I don't think about my feelings. It's genuinely because I'm, one, trying to take in everyone else's all day. So then when I leave, I'm exhausted. I'm like, I feel like I don't have time for my own feelings sometimes.
Yeah.
But then in the moments where I realize like, oh, okay, no, this is huge, which is why therapists should have therapists.
Please do.
Is because I know my old therapist, she would call me on my stuff.
Mine does
Alice,
too.
shout out. Like, she was great. She'd be like, are you really okay? And I'd be like, no. And then I'd probably cry. I cried every single session. Every single session.
It's a lot of feelings that like
it was
bubble
a lot.
up.
Yeah, so that was good for me. But yeah, suffering in silence. Like I will sit and I will almost therapize myself in my mind.
Oh gosh, I do the same thing. I can't react like I don't do the same thing.
Right. Like it just happens. I sit and I'm like, okay, well, I just, like did my own little therapy session in there and everyone else has got everything going on. And so maybe I shouldn't like speak up and talk about what's going on sometimes. And that's not healthy. I'm not going to say it's not good or bad because there's no good or bad, but that's not always healthy. Especially because I cannot be my own therapist.
No.
In the same way I can't be my friend's therapist or my parents' therapist or my boyfriend's therapist. I also cannot be my own therapist.
Yeah.
But yeah, the suffering in silence, it hits deep because just people will look at me and be like, are you okay? I'm like, yeah. What do you mean? Like, there's nothing that I should not be okay about. Like, everything's great. But sitting in the shower and just like contemplating my life.
I think that makes the like shift from professional to personal so important. Like I know like my drives to and from work are sacred. That is when like, no, like I am turning into a therapist now and like I am taking off my Hannah Montana wig essentially when I go home. And I think it's that idea of like it's so easy for us, we talk about it all the time, like our default is like sitting back and listening. And I notice that like even when I'm just physically tired or fatigued in a social setting, I'll just sit back and I'll listen and I'll observe, and I'm not working, but that's just my default, especially as an introvert. But so I always have to remind myself like, hey, like you deserve an eighth of the space that you encourage your clients to take up. I would say like you deserve the same amount of space, but it's just not authentic for myself. I'll work up to it, but
We're getting there.
that's just kind of the way things are. Kind of a side effect of the job, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think that like that kind of leads into another idea of therapy is weird, and the industry of therapy is very odd because it's technically healthcare. And I mean, I'm sitting here and it's basically a blanket. It's that long of a sweater, just in like jeans. We're just hanging out. But it's considered healthcare. Like we have NPI numbers, like we're able to diagnose and write treatment plans and things like that. But we're not treated like healthcare providers, I will say. And so I say that like what your therapist friend might not tell you is that therapists aren't really seen for what we truly do. And I used to equate it to someone like a teacher. But now like post-COVID, it's great that like teachers are a little bit more seen in the media. There's still a long ways to go with them, but there's at least like something out there now. But I think it goes just to say the same thing with a therapist is I don't consider myself to be like a white coat healthcare provider at all. That's also like my own healthcare trauma coming up, but I just try to be a little bit more like warm, and I'm lucky I do have warm white coat healthcare providers. It's great, but as like a field, we're not seen that way, and I don't think we operate in that way. So I think just like what we won't tell you is that a lot of people poke holes in what we do, and they'll like assume that it's usually like, oh, do you just sit there and listen all day? And especially because we work with kids, it's like, man, like I wish I could just sit there and play games all day. It's like, oh. And like, we're allowed to have our own reactions to those comments, and we definitely do. But I think that what people might not say from this field is that it's difficult to be misunderstood in what we do day to day, for sure.
I mean, even when I think back to college, psychology is called a soft science. It's not even called a science. It's a soft science. So it's like a step down from like nursing or dental. I mean, why?
Like, we don't have to equate like good versus bad. Like you said, like that doesn't mean anything. Like, we don't want to shortchange the hard sciences, because first of all, I could never do that. I changed my major for a reason. But it's like, why does soft have to be bad and like less respectable?
Right. Or why don't we just call them science? Like, we're just in the science field.
We're just in behavioral science.
Yeah, behavioral science. Yeah. Instead of like, oh, it's a part of, like, because I got my minors in sociology and women's gender, all the liberal arts.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I do. And so all of those were like soft sciences. It's like, but I'm doing the same amount of work. Right. Now, granted, there is no math involved unless you're in stat.
I love statistics, though.
Yeah.
I thrived in stat.
But yeah, 100%. It's looked at as, oh, you're a step down. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay. I mean, that's fine. Whatever. But I think that also plays into the next point of like the fatigue that goes along with that.
Compassion fatigue.
Yes. Compassion fatigue of you're spending all of this time in this space, listening to everyone else's lives, everyone's experiences, which is what we love. But even things that you love, it's exhausting.
Mm-hmm. And it takes a toll.
Yeah. And it's a different kind of exhausting than like working in another medical field or even another job where sometimes it's more physically demanding. And people don't look at your mind as something that could be exhausted sometimes, or even like your soul. Like, I know when I go home, I've been doing a Bible study with my friend Christina, and it almost, I can't give enough of my soul sometimes to be able to like just read and sit with that. And it's just like, oh, that stinks, and showing up in other relationships, like it'll come out of my compassion fatigue. People will feel it on me. Like, you're tired. Yeah. Like, did you have a rough day today? It's like, yeah, I saw like 7 people and it was really hard, and I didn't get lunch, but for like 30 minutes. So it's hard. And I know I've talked to a ton of therapists, and we're like, what do you do when you go home? I sit on my couch and I literally stare at a wall.
Sometimes I need to rot.
Yeah. Or I put on 90 Day Fiancé because you can follow it without actually having to follow it. Yeah. Just because my brain's not ready to work again.
Well, we've talked about it. Like, our retention for things at like an auditory level doesn't exist outside of work. Yeah. And I think that you're right, though. We don't check out of work. Like, people talk about work-life balance, and like there are elements of that in this field. Absolutely. Things like accessing your emails, doing like pen and paper work. But there is this idea of our work is in behavioral sciences. It is in the human experience. It's in thoughts. It's in feelings. It's in our behaviors. You can't check that at the door, because then you're not living. And so it is this idea of like, where is that limit? And I think that it's keeping on top of compassion fatigue is huge, because same thing. It's like, and sadly, it typically trickles down to the people you care about the most. Like, for me, it's my spouse. And there are some days where like he doesn't get the best of me and my clients do. Is that fair for him? No. Does he understand that it is a part of this job? Yes. But it is something that I have to intentionally be on top of. So if I do have one of those days where I go home and I'm like, I am not a present spouse right now, then it's like, I need to reel this in. That means I either have to see less clients during the day, or how am I not taking care of myself? Why am I feeling compassion fatigue? How do I prevent this before it hurts somebody else, ideally?
Yeah. Well, I do have a follow-up question, because I'm genuinely just interested. Yeah. How do you know when you've hit your limit of compassion fatigue and you like need a break?
So for me, it typically comes out in my health. My body tells me I'm stressed before like my mind does. I think I just get kind of numb to my own thoughts and feelings all the time. So my body will show up in ways of like lack of energy, and I get really bad night terrors. My sleep gets really erratic, and I have like true clinical night terrors. absolutely excruciating. So I have that, and then things like I lose my appetite. I always say like my appetite goes on sabbatical, and I just kind of feel off. It's just like this off feeling, and I'm a little bit more reactive, and I just get agitated a little bit easier. So do you know what your like tells are?
I cry.
Okay.
Just literally about like all things. And can't describe it, which I've always been a crier. Like I would cry when I was stressed, I was cry when I was sad, I was cry when I was angry, anxious. So now when I'm hitting that compassion fatigue like boundary and that level, I just start crying and tearing up about like everything, and that's how I know. And my fuse, I get a very short fuse.
It happens.
But then I also shut down.
I do the same thing. I shut down, and I shut people out, and I don't realize it. Again, like I feel like all these things just really emphasize that being a therapist is such an experience in accountability, I will say. Like I feel like to be a good, effective therapist means that you are on top of yourself too. Yeah. Because we always talk about like self-development. It's like if you aren't developing as a person, like chances are like your clinical work isn't doing much either. So it's hard.
Yeah. And if I'm like not showing up for myself,
I
can't get into a room and show up for someone else. And that was one thing in the beginning, like when I was getting my APC, is at first it was middle school. I was teaching middle school during the day, and then I was going at night and I was doing private practice work. And I would be in there and I just couldn't function. And then that's when I realized like, no, pushing through is not a part of this job. Yeah. Like you cannot just quote unquote push through and still be a good therapist. You have got to take time off. And so that's been very hard, especially because when you take time off, there becomes like ethical issues with that. Of you have to, depending on how long, you have to find another therapist to take over that work. And then a lot of times they're like, well, I don't want to see that therapist. And then you feel bad for taking time off because you're like, well, I see this client every week or every other week. I can't take a week off. What if they need me? But then at the same point, like what other job does that? Where they're like, I can't take a week off because what if they like need me in this capacity?
Teachers.
Yeah. Teachers
for sure. But that's also
school counselors.
It's a more system issue, but same thing with therapists.
Yeah.
So I will say, so if someone is listening to this and they're thinking like, oh gosh, something your therapist friend didn't tell you is compassion fatigue is real. What would a non-clinical person do in that position? If they were having that thought of like, wow, like I didn't realize that existed. Like, how can you be a supportive friend, especially with like specifically compassion fatigue? So if like a friend of yours notices that like you're starting to be like tearful more, what would you want them to do?
Oh, that's tough. Honestly, I think I would just want them to say like, hey, what do you need right now?
Yeah. Be like, you good?
Yeah. Like literally just to like, pretend that I am no one and I have no feelings currently and just let it out. Because for me, and this is a personal thing, so not everyone is like this, but I feel so bad talking about my feelings because I know other people also have feelings. So I don't want to compound on it. And like I tell my clients all the time, like, you are just as important. Your feelings are just as important. You deserve to have space. But then I get out of that room and I'm like, I don't know if I should be talking about this right now because you've got a lot going on. But I think that just literally having someone say like, how can I help you? Like, what do you need right now? Do we need to just go to the movie and say nothing and then we'll talk after? Do we need to blast some music? And that's been actually a conversation that my boyfriend and I have had recently, because they kept wanting to offer advice. He kept wanting to offer advice.
Which is so hard because it's so well intended.
Very well intended. And I appreciate it so much. And some days I wanted that advice.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
But then other days I didn't want to hear it. And so we had the conversation of, hey, like, I would love if you would just ask, like, what I needed. Like, hey, do you want advice or do you want me to just listen? Yeah. And that helps so much with me personally, is just having that option of, would you rather have this or would you rather have this? And give me only 2 options, because any more than 2, my head's going to freak out and I'm going to pick none. And then, like, I get to decide in that moment, do I want to be emotional right now? Do I want to have feelings right now? Or do I want to find solutions for this?
So basically, if you notice that in somebody that's a therapist, but you know them personally, it's basically just like ask questions, be curious, and not have an assumption, maybe.
Yeah. And to just be there.
Yeah.
And like ask about me.
Show up as a person.
Yeah. And not as like, I want to be your therapist, because like I don't want a therapist.
Don't want that.
I'm good.
We have a whole list of people we
yes,
can...
like I just want my friend, or I want my parents, or I want my boyfriend, or whoever it is.
Dog.
Dog.
My dog.
Penny's the best. It just given snugs and it just works. Okay, so like what about you?
That's hard. If someone knows like compassion fatigue, well, I think it's different. There's layers to it. I'd say if you're just a friend is asking. Like, I think it goes a long way to just ask someone like, how are you? And like genuinely asking like, hey, like, how's it going? I actually don't think I'm asked that very often, and not as like a negative thing. I just think that it shows like my relationships. It's like one ongoing conversation all the time, which I love. Like, it's very fun. But I think sometimes we get so close to each other in friendships that we forget like the basics of like, hey, like, how are you? Yeah. Or like, yo, I know this is going on. Like, or I actually don't know what's going on. How's it going? So I think just like being faced with like a question and curiosity is really helpful. And then the same thing of like, hey, like, how can I love on you? Or if it's really rough and if someone sees that I'm just kind of like in my shell, don't ask, just do. And if they know me that well, and because typically if someone says something like, how can I help you? If I'm really in the depths of compassion fatigue, I probably won't know how to answer that question. Yeah. And so sometimes it's just like showing up. It's, hey, like, I'm going to send you $5 Starbucks gift card, which you've done for me before. When I was feeling a lot of compassion fatigue, pouring into too many people outside of work. Right. It's just doing that. It's just saying like, hey, like, I know you're going through a lot. You've got a lot on your plate. I'm going to give you 3 options of restaurants that we'll go to. Pick a day, and then we'll pick one of them that day. I think just like making things happen is helpful.
And I think you mentioned something so important, and that's like intentionality. Yeah. Because a lot of times when people ask, hey, how are you? They're not expecting a real answer sometimes.
No, it's always like, I'm fine. How are you?
Whereas saying like, here's $5. Like, I want you to go get a Starbucks. It was, I know something's up. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Yes. But I am thinking about you and I'm going to do this. If you need something different, we'll figure that out. And like the less amount of options, the better. Like, I've got 3 restaurants for you. Let's do this. Yeah,
I'd say it's like some of the best support is like giving options, like you said, too. Talking and not talking. Yeah. Because I feel like people assume that because we're a therapist, that means we want to talk about it all the time. No.
Or that we're going to show up and tell you exactly what we want in the perfect way that we're going to do it, which moves into the next part of like feeling on this pedestal that we do everything right all the time.
And like we're not problematic.
Yeah. It's like, no, I've 100% have hit a toxic level and I'd be like, whoa, girl, like what was that? Where was that coming from? But it is that idea of like, they don't need me. Like they, or, you know, well, they said that must be what they're really thinking because they must have really thought that out. Now, sometimes I just like pop off or sometimes I haven't thought about it at all because I'm not perfect.
Right. Well, and but it's hard because like to get to this point where like we are fully licensed independent clinicians that co-own a business. Yeah. That does mean that we've had to have our ducks in a row to an extent. So there are a lot of things that we have not only done, but we've done it very well. But that doesn't mean that there have been like missteps along the way. If anything, there have been a lot. Yeah. And I totally agree that like, because it's one thing if a client is asking you to model something or if I actually love when a client says like, have you utilized this yourself? Because something I pride myself on is I won't give a client a coping skill I haven't tried myself. And sometimes I'll have to be like, yeah, I tried it and I don't like it. Like, please don't tell me to box breathe ever.
Journaling. That's mine. Don't tell me to journal.
See, I love to journal, but do not tell me to do box breathing. And it won't work well. But I think there's this idea that like what your therapist friend might not tell you is that they do feel like they're on a pedestal sometimes as a person. And there's this idea of like once we leave therapy, like you can't have an expression of feeling that is seen as like less than or dysfunctional, or like you can't have a vice or you can't just have a bad day. Not to say that like there's ever an excuse, but sometimes it's like, hey, like you're allowed to be a person and make mistakes along the way.
We are not robots.
No,
that's the biggest thing. And not even just like a, you know, like we're gonna answer your question, but like I'm a perfect feelings robot where I know how to be compassionate and how to empathize and how to think about you, but then also how to think about me and to think about all of these. It's like some days I can't do that. And like I'll show up in the room and I'm on because like this is our job. And so we know how to do our job well. But then when we walk out, it's like, I can't do it sometimes. And I think that because of that, I don't know if you've ever seen this in your life, but if I make like a misstep or if I do something that's hurt someone, it's almost like it's 5 times worse.
I'm the same way, absolutely.
Because one, I feel like I should have done better, which that's unfair to think that I need to always be perfect. But 2, that sometimes they think that I should have done better and that I should have known, and that it's almost like and no one gets a free pass, but it's almost like if you're not a therapist, you get more of a free pass to be able to say something hurtful versus if you are a therapist and you say something hurtful, it's like,
So sometimes it's like well, they just had a long day. It's like, no, there's never an excuse for a therapist to be cruel to another person, but we can give grace to a human being making a mistake. Yeah. If it is intentional, if it's a therapist doing something that is not okay, not okay. If it's a human being doing something out of malice, not okay. But if it is a person making a mistake, like, it's okay.
Yeah. And sometimes, mistakes are big. Yeah. But, like, that's going to happen. And as long as we, like, recognize it and say, oh, man, I'm so sorry. Like, you're exactly right. Or even, just, like, how can I fix that? What can I do? Like, we got to step up and we got to do that in general. But it is very hard to feel like you have to constantly be on and that you're never going to have a slip up.
Sure, absolutely. So on that same vein, I think that it's important to say that something your therapist friend might not tell you is that this job can be pretty lonely sometimes. And I think that can be surprising for a lot of people because, I mean, I'm an introvert. Like, my social battery is tapped by the end of a full client day. Like, I remember earlier this week when we had, we started working on a project and we had some loved ones come help. Then we had a networking lunch and then I saw clients afterwards. And then I had a meeting after work. My social battery was so tapped. But even on those days, like, you can feel very lonely because what people don't really think about is, like, is this job highly social? Yeah, absolutely. Like, we are constantly interacting with other people. We're never really alone in a room, but we can feel very alone ourselves. Something I talked to a friend about recently is that because they were asking a question about like ethics and former clients and things like that. And I had to say that, hey, like, we have to realize that, like, we're basically in an emotional relationship with dozens of people. But it's one-sided. Yeah. It's literally a one-sided emotional relationship all the time. And my voice just went, like, up an octave in that, which is funny. Because it makes me uncomfortable to think about sometimes because it's not balanced, but it shouldn't be balanced. Right. And that does cause a lot of isolation and loneliness. And I think that just with those qualities in a therapist, like, it can make us a little bit less present socially, too.
Yeah. And I will say, sometimes I intentionally do that. Like, when someone texts me at the end of a day, there's some days I'm like, I can't respond. And that's even just a text message.
I'm the same way.
But it's like, and I don't want to answer and not give 100% of my thought and my soul in that. So I'll leave it. And then a lot of people are like, are you okay? And it's like, yeah, I'm so sorry. Like, I genuinely just could not give enough of myself into this. It has nothing to do with you. It's more just like, I am so introverted, which a lot of people are very surprised to hear that, like, I'm introverted. I get the same thing. You. They're like, what? You talk to people for a living?
So introverted.
And it's like, yeah, no, if I could genuinely sit in a room by myself for 5 hours and be content.
I love that.
And not talk to anyone, like, literally at all. And so it is very hard to leave this work and then to feel like sometimes I don't have people checking in on me, but then 2, to feel like sometimes I don't have the effort to check in on everyone else all the time. Yeah. Especially those people that I know, if I text you, there's going to be an issue. And it's like some days I don't know.
I don't have it in me.
I don't know if I can. And then the next day I definitely will. But
luckily it's always short-lived for sure.
Yeah, thankfully. It usually has at least like 6 hours. After 6 hours I like reboot and I reset. But sometimes I will do it to myself, like you mentioned earlier about your compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, I will isolate myself, and then I'm sad because I'm by myself and I needed someone, but at the same point I did it to myself. So it just plays into that whole cycle of like, one, this job is so demanding on
your soul,
all things.
Yeah.
But then you leave, and then I overanalyze like the way that I'm presenting in a relationship. So then if I don't feel like I have the energy to present in the way that I want to and who I genuinely am and what that person needs and deserves, then I don't. But then that can sometimes like break down friendships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that some people do expect your friend who's a therapist to constantly be on. I think that kind of like sums up a lot of these things of like being on a pedestal, not being able to make mistakes, things like that. So we're just people at the end of the day. And I think that our style specifically, like, we are a human first and then we're a therapist second. Like we even talked at the beginning of this episode, that's not our one defining characteristic. It's one of many. And so if at the end of the day, like, it does feel a little bit isolating, like, it's okay. It's just like if you are an accountant and you're in tax season, like, hello, you're probably not going to want to do anything afterwards, and that is fine. I think it's all just about balance. It just gets tricky when like emotions are involved
because they're all the time.
Yes, absolutely.
Like I love that example. It's like tax season. It's like, no, I don't want to do my taxes. I don't want to talk about other people's taxes. I don't want to have anything to do with probably money in general. But like with feelings, that's all day, every day. So it's not like you can just like avoid feelings.
You can.
You technically can.
They'll just really bubble back up and bubble over.
Like the Coke experience. Shake it up. It's going to explode. But like you can't avoid.
No.
It's very hard. Well, if you are showing up in a manner in which you are trying to be a fully processing human at the time, then you can't avoid any feelings. Even if you try to. It's like, why am I crying? Oh, well.
So I think that kind of brings up, like, there are so many things that the therapist in your life might not mention to you, but I think it's worth saying that, like, it's never because we don't like what we do. It's just a side effect of what we do. Just like any other job, it just has really specific stipulations, I will say. Like something that my husband and I kind of debate, not often, but semi-often, is like work-life balance. Because sometimes he'll look at me and he'll be like, you gotta leave work at work, and I'll look at him and I'll say, I work in feelings. Like, I can't really leave feelings at work, nor do I want to, because I don't want to be this person who only expresses and experiences a feeling in one situation or another. So I think that just kind of begs the question of, like, if there is a therapist in your life who you know at a personal level, what are some things that you can do to support them?
And I think we tapped in with the compassion fatigue of just like showing up.
Yeah.
Like genuinely just showing up. Support wise, I love the intentionality that you mentioned, like being intentional of, especially when we are spending time together, let's be intentional about that time and let's build our relationship. Please. Like, I don't want to show up and then, I don't know, talk about, I don't even know what an example would be.
Just some kind of like crisis or an issue the whole time.
Yes.
Like, yes, we'll still be friends. I want to know what's happening, but please don't allow that. And I'll try to be accountable myself, but like it can be easy for that to dominate conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Especially because, not to brag, but I feel like both of us are very welcoming to those. Like, we're like, okay, like, what is going on?
And like, please tell me if something's happening. Like, I want to support you.
Yeah, like, I want to be there in your life, and that's so important. But at the same point, just because I'm offering, which this is not always the best thing for me to think, but just because I'm offering, don't take it all the time.
Well, and also when we say something like, I want to be there to help you and support you, that doesn't mean I want to be there to be your therapist.
Yeah.
And I think that something your therapist friend won't tell you is that we can tell if you're not in therapy. And that is one of the most isolating things that you can get as a therapist, at least for me, is there is not a moral good or bad about being in therapy. If you are not in therapy, doesn't mean that you're a bad person. If you are in therapy, doesn't mean you're a good person. But like we've really talked about, is when our jobs are all about awareness and insight and self-improvement and development, it does not mean that we are on a moral scale that is higher or lower than anybody else. We're just trying to figure things out like everybody else. But it does mean that if we're around people who don't invest in themselves in a similar way, there's a divide. It really is. And it can feel very isolating. And I think that it really is refreshing when I'm able to be present with a friend who is in therapy, because they're already on top of where they're at. And even if they're going through something, I can tell that they're working with someone to manage it and process it. Yeah. And I never feel like I have to work. And I think it's this idea of not only that, but like, I also know that like they value the work that I do.
That too.
That's really hard. Important. If someone's like, no, therapy's not for me, I'm like, this is my job. It's like, oh, like if you broke a bone and you said you would heal it yourself and not go to a doctor, if I was an orthopedic surgeon, like, would you still respect what I did? Yeah. So I think that just adds the layers to it. So I'd say like the ways to support the therapist friend in your life is to take care of yourself.
That's a great answer.
Very much so.
Yeah, to take care of yourself. And I love that. And, to caveat that and to work off of that, like, it is totally understandable if we cannot always be in therapy.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Like, I'm not in therapy currently because I don't have the ability to get into therapy right now. And that's just very real. So, like, not at all are we expecting, like, everyone needs to be in therapy all the time if you want to be my friend. But, like, at least, like, be able to have an outlet for yourself that's not always us.
And do some kind of reflection and some kind of, like, development. And that doesn't even have to be therapy sometimes, because like we talk about all the time, there's so many barriers to this work, like we can't afford ourselves, which says a lot about also like the state that we're in at a micro and a macro level. But I think it's this idea of if you're able to really invest in yourself and be able to understand where you're at as a person, you can just show up better in your friendships. I just think if your friend also happens to be a therapist, it will be very lonely for them if you're not a little bit accountable with yourself. Yeah. And that's not to add guilt or blame on anyone. It's just a dynamic that happens and it exists.
Yeah. And it's important. We love you guys. We really do. We love you. We want to be there for you. We want to support you.
I just don't want to be a therapist.
We also want like you to support us a little bit sometimes. Yeah. And I think that that's like one of the best parts of being a therapist is being able to know like when to say, hey, I think, maybe we just go and we putt and we just talk about, for me, it's like trash TV, reality TV. Like, let's just go and talk about reality TV and like eat some appies, because I need that. Yes. And sometimes it's good to show up and not be working for both me and for you because you don't want to see me as a therapist all day every day. Like,
they probably won't like us.
No. Like that would be a lot. I'd be holding you accountable probably a lot more than you want. Yeah. But for all the little therapist girlies and guilies and everyone else, like, we love you guys and we're here for you, and we're so glad that we are able to create this platform where we can have these conversations and be open. And if you ever have any questions for us, let us know. We have our Insta. We also have our Couch Convos Pod Insta, which is at Couch Convos Pod. Very easy to remember. But like, hit us up. But also remember that this is not a substitute for therapy. No. And our DM boxes are also not therapy.
Correct.
So, but if you would like services, check out our website, www.soulhavengeorgia.com.
So I'd say to wrap things up, what is your favorite part about being a therapist? Because I feel like there's been a lot of like just extra considerations about therapy, sometimes the negative sides of being a therapist. But like, what do you love about it?
This is so cheesy. I just love my kids. Yeah. Like, I love just being able to spend time with my kids and be able to be like in their world. Like, there's one client that I'm thinking of specifically, and they feel like they're an outcast everywhere. But when they come into my room, they're like, I just feel so comfy here. I'm like, I am so proud to be able to have a space and to have a job where I make someone feel so safe and comfortable just by being there. And we get to hang out. Like, we're going to talk about feelings, but we are also going to play, like, Uno, and we're going to draw, and we're going to do all of those things, and they're going to leave. Sometimes they're going to leave. Sometimes they're going to leave happy. There's other days they're not going to leave happy. That's part of therapy, too. We might get into that about crying after therapy and what that's like.
Let's say about that one.
Yeah, but I think that just being able to show up and make someone feel safe and comfortable and, like, welcome in my space.
Yeah. I love that. I would definitely agree. I think one of my favorite parts about being a therapist is being real and being honest about your experiences and about life, because I think about like corporate events, networking events that aren't as clinical. And I'm like, man, like, how do you all do this? Like, I have no tolerance for small talk anymore because what we do is so intentional and so raw and real. I love that side of what we do.
Yeah.
And it is just so wonderfully authentic, especially like when you're able to step up to the plate yourself and be authentic. It's just such a great dynamic. It's just a beautiful part of the world. But yeah.
Sweet. Well, thanks for joining us on episode 2. Number 3 hopefully is going to come up.
Very soon.
Yes, very soon. We're going to be talking about the holidays. So you're going to want to check in for that one, since we got Christmas coming up and we just passed Thanksgiving, which can be hard.
It is, absolutely. But if anyone has any specific holiday woes, stressors, anxieties, or questions, feel free to drop in the comments on Instagram, on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, on our website, whatever is most convenient and accessible for you. Please do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.